The morning sun cast long shadows across the old porch as James Harrington stood holding the letter that would change everything. At 45, with salt and pepper hair and hands that had grown soft from years behind a desk, he never thought he'd come back to ranch life. "Your grandfather left you everything," the family lawyer had told him 3 weeks earlier. All 500 acres of the Double H Ranch. James had built a good life in Austin, a solid career as a land attorney, a downtown apartment, restaurants that knew his usual order. The ranch was his childhood, not his future. At least that's what he'd always told himself. But standing there now, looking out at the rolling Texas, hills that stretched toward the horizon, something inside him shifted. The ranch wasn't just land, it was history. His history. The pickup truck kicked up dust as James drove along the fence line, taking stock of what was now his. The old barn needed work. The cattle pen sat empty. His grandfather's pickup truck hadn't moved in months, but James knew it would start with just a little attention. His grandfather had taught him that, how to bring old things back to life. "Things built right don't just die, Jimmy," he'd say. "They just need someone who cares enough to wake them up again." As James crested the hill on the north property line, he slowed the truck. Something wasn't right. Where there used to be open rangeland stretching for miles, now stood rows of big houses with perfect lawns and identical mailboxes. A huge stone entrance with Saddlebrook Estates carved into it marked the entrance, complete with a guard booth and a man in uniform checking cars. "That's new," James muttered, turning the truck around. Back at the house, James dug through his grandfather's desk. Bills, receipts, cattle records, all organized in his grandfather's neat handwriting. Then he found a folder labeled "Property Dispute, Important." Inside were dozens of letters, all with the same letterhead: Saddlebrook, Estates Homeowners Association. As James read through them, his stomach tightened. The letters started polite enough, explaining that due to a minor boundary adjustment made 15 years ago, his grandfather's ranch technically fell within their community guidelines. They invited him to join their association, pay dues, and follow their rules about everything from fence height to what animals he could keep. His grandfather's replies started polite too, but got shorter and more direct as time passed. The last one was just 3 lines. "This ranch was here before your fancy houses. It'll be here after they're gone. Don't write again." James smiled. That sounded like Grandpa Joe. He spent the next few weeks throwing himself into ranch work. The physical labor felt good after years at a desk. He fixed fences, cleared brush, and started repairing the old barn. Every muscle in his body ached, but it was a good kind of pain. At night, he sat on the porch drinking his grandfather's favorite whiskey, watching the stars come out one by one. City lights had stolen this view from most people, but out here, the sky still belonged to the stars. One morning, a shiny white SUV pulled up to the house. A woman in a suit too formal for ranch life stepped out, looking around with obvious disapproval. "Mr. Harrington?" "I'm Veronica Bennett, president of the Saddlebrook Estates Homeowners Association." She didn't offer to shake hands. Instead, she held out a thick envelope. "This is formal notice of accumulated dues and violations. We've been more than patient with this property." James took the envelope without opening it. "Nice to meet you, too. Your grandfather refused to acknowledge reality, Mr. Harrington. But times change. This area is developing. Property values are rising. We simply can't have an eyesore affecting our community standards." "Eyesore?" James looked around at the land his family had worked for generations. This ranch has been here for 100 years. And now it's part of Saddlebrook Estates, whether you like it or not. The boundary adjustment was never agreed to by my grandfather." James finished. Her smile tightened. "This isn't about agreement. It's about legal documentation. Open the letter, Mr. Harrington. $15,000 in back dues. Citations for unauthorized structures, improper land use, livestock violations. This is just the beginning. Compliance is not optional." After she left, James opened the letter. The violations were ridiculous. Improper agricultural use of residential property, unsightly structures, unapproved fencing materials, but the $15,000 bill was very real. That night, James couldn't sleep. He walked the property under moonlight thinking. In Austin, he handled land disputes all the time. He knew the law better than most, including the fact that the HOA's claims were built on shaky ground. Any property boundary change affecting land over 100 acres required state-level approval through the Land Grant Commission. What the fancy HOA with their threats and fines didn't realize was that James didn't just know the land laws, he enforced them. As commissioner for the state's Land Grant Commission, he was the final authority on property disputes like this across the entire state. He could shut down their claims with one phone call. But something held him back. His grandfather hadn't used connections or pulled strings. He'd stood his ground on principle. Maybe that was the right way. As dawn broke over the eastern pasture, James made his decision. He wouldn't reveal his position yet. He'd try to resolve this properly first. Give them a chance to back down gracefully. Let's see what kind of people we're dealing with, he said to the old ranch house as if his grandfather might still be listening. Then we'll decide what to do. Little did he know that this decision would set in motion events that would test not just his legal knowledge, but everything he believed about justice, home, and how far people will go when power and money are at stake. Ames adjusted his tie and checked his watch. 6:30. The Saddlebrook Estates Community Center parking lot was already half full. He grabbed his folder of documents from the passenger seat and took a deep breath. Just stick to the facts, he told himself. Give them a chance to do the right thing. Inside, the community center looked more like a country club. Polished floors, fancy light fixtures, a table with coffee and cookies that probably cost more than what most folks spend on a week's groceries. About 30 people sat in neat rows facing a long table where 5 people sat looking important. James recognized Veronica Bennett right away. Next to her sat an older man with steel gray hair and the kind of tan that comes from golf courses, not honest work. The nameplate in front of him read, Richard Campbell, Vice President. Let's move on to new business, Veronica announced as James found a seat in the back. Mr. Thomas has a complaint about the Johnsons' unapproved wind chimes. And then, excuse me, James stood up. I'd like to address the board about an urgent matter. All heads turned. Veronica's smile didn't reach her eyes. And you are? James Harrington, Double H Ranch. I received your notice of violations and back dues. The room went quiet. James could feel people staring. Mr. Harrington, we have a process for disputes. You can fill out a form and I've brought documentation showing that my property is legally exempt from HOA jurisdiction, James said, holding up his folder. I'd like to clear this up right away. Richard Campbell leaned forward. Your grandfather was told repeatedly that the boundary adjustment brought his property, now your property, under our jurisdiction. This isn't new. That adjustment was never properly registered with the state, James replied. Under Texas law, any boundary change affecting more than 100 acres requires approval from the Land Grant Commission. That never happened. A woman, in the second row, whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. That's the troublemaker's grandson. Veronica tapped her gavel. Mr. Harrington, this meeting has an agenda. Your boundary dispute isn't on it. If you'd like to present your case, you can request time at next month's meeting. Next month? James stepped forward. You've given me 2 weeks to pay $15,000 in illegitimate fees before you place a lien on my property. Richard Campbell stood up, all 6-foot-something of him. Son, your grandfather was a stubborn man who thought rules didn't apply to him. Now you show up with the same attitude. This community has standards, rules. Without them, property values suffer. Nobody wants to buy $1 million home next to a run-down ranch with rusty equipment and smelly animals. The insult to both his grandfather and the ranch hit James like a physical blow. He'd come ready for a reasonable discussion. Clearly, that wasn't happening. My ranch was there long before your fancy houses, James said, his voice steady despite his anger. And it's not rundown. It's a working ranch. It's supposed to have equipment and animals. Not anymore, Veronica said with finality. Times change. Mr. Harrington, Clearwater County is developing. Your grandfather refused to accept progress. We hoped you might be more reasonable. James looked around the room. Most people avoided his eyes. A few looked uncomfortable, but nobody spoke up. I'll see you next month then, James said finally, tucking his folder under his arm. But the clock on your 2-week deadline stops now. I've officially disputed your claim. He walked out with his head high, though his hands were shaking with anger by the time he reached his truck. The next morning, James found a new notice taped to his gate. This one cited him for unauthorized gathering of residents without proper permits. Apparently, his attending their public meeting counted as some kind of violation. The fine was $500. 3 days later, he spotted a white Saddlebrook Security SUV parked across from his south pasture. A man with binoculars was taking pictures of James's cattle. When James walked toward him, the SUV drove away quickly. The pattern continued. Every improvement James made to the ranch triggered a new violation. Notice, when he repaired the roof on the old barn, using the same materials his grandfather had used, he got hit with a $2,000 fine for unauthorized construction without architectural review. When he mended fences, another notice appeared claiming his fence height exceeded regulations by 2 inches. James documented everything, took pictures of the security vehicles, kept every notice in a growing file. He called the county sheriff once when he found someone actually on his property taking pictures, but by the time Deputy Wilson arrived, the trespasser was gone. Look, James, the deputy said, looking uncomfortable. These Saddlebrook folks have a lot of pull in the county these days. Judge Campbell's brother-in-law sits on the county commission. They've donated money for the new courthouse. I'm not saying it's right, but I'm on my own, James finished. The deputy just shrugged. That evening, James sat at his kitchen table with all the documentation spread out before him. He could make one phone call to his office in Austin, reveal who he was, and shut this whole thing down. But something still held him back. If he used his position that way, wouldn't he be just like them? Throwing weight around, using connections, instead of following proper process? He was still thinking about it when he heard vehicles approaching. Looking out the window, he saw 3 Saddlebrook Security SUVs parked by his eastern fence line. Men were placing survey stakes along the inside of his property. James grabbed his hat and strode out to confront them. What do you think you're doing? This is private property. A man in a suit stepped forward holding a document. We're conducting an official resurvey of the boundary line. Our records indicate your fence encroaches on Saddlebrook Estates Common land by approximately 12 feet. James felt cold anger settle in his stomach. The eastern fence line was where his main water source was, the spring that fed his irrigation system. You can't just show up and start moving property lines, James said. We're merely confirming what's already in the records, the man replied smoothly. The HOA board voted last night to enforce the correct boundaries. You'll receive official notice tomorrow. As they drove away, James watched the sun setting behind his grandfather's old barn. They were after his water rights. This wasn't about community standards or property values. This was a land grab, plain and simple. That night, James made his decision. He'd give the system one more chance. He'd file a formal appeal with the HOA, board with all his documentation. If they rejected it, when they rejected it, then he'd stop playing nice. What the good people of Saddlebrook Estates didn't know was that they weren't just pushing around some city lawyer who'd inherited his grandpa's old ranch. They were poking a bear who could do a whole lot more than growl back. The trip to Austin wasn't something James could avoid. The quarterly land commission meeting required all commissioners to attend in person, and he'd already postponed his ranch business too many times. He'd hired Miguel Ramirez, a local rancher's son, to keep an eye on things while he was gone. Just check the cattle and make sure nobody's messing with the fence lines, James told Miguel before leaving. I'll be back tomorrow night. The Austin meeting dragged on longer than expected. Boundary, disputes from 3 counties, water rights issues along the Rio Grande, paperwork that needed signing. By the time they finished, it was after 9, too late to make the 3-hour drive back to the ranch. James checked into a hotel near the Capitol building. He'd just stepped out of the shower when his phone rang. Miguel's name flashed on the screen. "Hey, Miguel, everything okay at the ranch?" There was just breathing on the other end, fast and panicked. "Miguel?" "Fire," Miguel finally said, his voice shaking. "The old barn, Mr. Harrington. It's burning. Fire department's here, but it's bad." James felt like the floor had dropped away beneath him. "What happened?" "Don't know. I was checking the north pasture. Saw the glow from across the property. By the time I got back, flames were already through the roof." "Is anyone hurt?" James asked, already throwing clothes into his overnight bag. "No, sir, but everything in there." James knew what Miguel meant. His grandfather's restored 1952 John Deere tractor, the old tools that had built the ranch piece by piece, the leather-bound journals going back to 1920 when his great-grandfather had first settled the land. "I'm on my way," James said, his voice tight. "Call me if anything changes." The drive back was the longest 3 hours of James's life. Every mile marker seemed to crawl by as his headlights cut through the dark Texas night. He tried to focus on driving safely, but his mind kept seeing flames, kept imagining everything he was losing. It was just past midnight when he turned onto the ranch road. He could see the glow from a mile away, could smell the smoke before he even rolled down his window. Fire trucks lined the driveway, their red lights spinning silently now, the urgency over but the damage done. The old barn was just a blackened skeleton against the night sky. Firefighters were still spraying water. On hot spots, steam rising ghostly in the floodlights. The tractor was just a twisted hulk of metal. Nothing left of the wooden work tables, the hay loft, the tack room with all its history. Fire Chief Thompson walked over as James got out of his truck. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes tired. "I'm sorry, James. We got here as quick as we could. But old wood like that goes up like paper." James nodded, not trusting himself to speak yet. "Any idea how it started?" he finally asked. The fire chief looked uncomfortable. "Can't say for certain yet. But I'll tell you straight, it doesn't look like an accident. There was an accelerant used. Gasoline, most likely." "You're saying someone did this deliberately?" James felt cold despite the heat still coming off the ruins. "Found a gas can about 50 yards away in the brush. And Miguel says there's no gas stored in the barn normally. We're treating it as suspicious." James remembered the security camera he'd installed just last week after finding boot prints near his house. It was aimed at the main drive, but it might have caught something. "I have a security camera," he told the chief. "Let me check the footage." Inside the house, James pulled up the video on his laptop. The night vision footage showed the driveway, the edge of the barn just visible in the frame. At 9:42 p.m., two figures appeared, moving quickly toward the barn. They stayed out of the direct light, but one detail jumped out. One of them was wearing a jacket with reflective strips, the same kind the Saddlebrook security guards wore. "Son of a," James whispered. He showed the footage to Chief Thompson, who frowned deeply. "I'll need a copy of this," he said. "But James, I should warn you. Sheriff Dawson handles the investigation from here, and he's tight with some of those Saddlebrook folks." James knew what he meant. Sheriff Dawson and Judge Campbell were fishing buddies, played poker together every Thursday night. The investigation would go nowhere. By dawn, the firefighters were gone. James sat on his porch steps staring at the smoking ruins, exhaustion and anger fighting for control. Miguel brought him a cup of coffee, stood awkwardly nearby. "You should get some rest," James told him. "You did everything you could." "I should have been closer to the house," Miguel said, guilt heavy in his voice. "If I'd seen them coming, you might have gotten hurt." James cut him off. "Or worse. This isn't on you." After Miguel left, James walked through the ruins once it was cool enough. The smell of wet ash and scorched metal filled his lungs. Little remained that was recognizable. A twisted piece of metal that might have been a plow blade. The melted remains of old harnesses. His grandfather's journals were just piles of ash. He was picking through the debris when a white SUV pulled up. Not a surprise to see Veronica Bennett step out, immaculate as always despite the early hour. What was surprising was the envelope in her hand and the barely concealed satisfaction on her face. "Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice all fake sympathy. "What a terrible accident. The board wanted me to personally deliver our concerns." She held out the envelope. James didn't take it. "The board is concerned about the visual impact of fire damage on neighboring properties," she continued when he didn't speak. "As per section 47.3 of the community guidelines, all debris must be removed within 72 hours. James still didn't reach for the envelope. "There's also the matter of improper storage of flammable materials, which clearly led to this unfortunate incident." At that, James found his voice. "The fire chief says it was arson. Someone poured gasoline all over my barn and lit it up." If she was surprised by this, she didn't show it. Well, that would be a matter for the sheriff, I suppose. Though between us, old buildings with old wiring often lead to tragedy. Perhaps this is a blessing in disguise. A blessing? James couldn't believe what he was hearing. "The board has authorized me to make you an offer in light of recent events." She pulled a second envelope from her bag. "We're prepared to purchase your property at 40% of market value, considering the extensive violations and needed remediation. It would spare you further incidents." The threat was thinly veiled, but it was there. Pay up, sell out, or there might be more fires. James took the envelope this time, but only so she could see him tear it in half. "Get off my property," he said quietly. "I strongly suggest you reconsider," she replied, her smile gone. "The offer expires in 48 hours. After she left, James stood in the center of what used to be his grandfather's barn, the place where he'd learned to fix engines, mend tack, birth calves. The place where his grandfather had told him stories of the old days, passed down skills that most people had forgotten. In that moment, something changed in James Harrington. The careful, by-the-book attorney gave way to something older and harder, something with deep roots in this land. He walked to his truck, pulled out his briefcase, and took out his land commission credentials. The time for playing nice was over. "You want a war?" he said to the empty air. "You've got one." The county records office smelled like old paper and dust. James sat at a small desk in the back corner, surrounded by stacks of land deeds, development permits, and water rights certificates. The clerk, an older woman named Dorothy, who'd worked there for 30 years, kept bringing him more files. "Found those original Saddlebrook permits you asked about," she said, dropping another folder on his growing pile. "Had to dig through the basement archives. Nobody's looked at these in years." "Thanks, Dorothy, I appreciate it. Mind if I ask what you're looking for?" Her eyes were curious behind thick glasses. "Been working here since before your grandfather bought his second pasture. Never seen anybody dig this deep into county records." James looked up from a document he'd been studying. "Just trying to understand how Saddlebrook Estates got their approvals. Some things don't add up." Dorothy lowered her voice. "Between us, there was a lot of rush when that development went in. Commissioner Taylor was pushing it hard, then retired right after with a nice new boat." She tapped the folder. "Might find some interesting reading in there." For 2 weeks, James barely slept. During the day, he'd drive to neighboring counties to check their records. At night, he'd spread documents across his kitchen table, connecting dots, finding patterns. He was building a case piece by piece, not just a defense of his property, but something bigger. What he found shocked even him. The original environmental impact study for Saddlebrook Estates was missing key sections about water runoff and wildlife habitat protection. The development permits had been pushed through on an accelerated timeline, skipping several required public hearings. But the smoking gun was what he found buried in a box of miscellaneous paperwork in the Water District office. The water rights that Saddlebrook claimed, the rights they were trying to take from his eastern boundary, had never been properly transferred from the original ranching association. His grandfather had been one of the founding members of that association back in the 1970s. Most damning of all, the property line adjustment that the HOA kept referencing had never been registered with the State Land Grant Commission. Under FED, Texas law, any boundary change affecting properties over 100 acres required this final registration step. Without it, the adjustment had never legally happened. On paper, Saddlebrook Estates was standing on shaky ground. James made copies of everything, created a timeline, wrote a detailed analysis. Then he did something he'd been avoiding. He put on his land commissioner hat. Officially, he called the county commissioner's office and scheduled a hearing, not as James Harrington, ranch owner, but as Commissioner Harrington of the State Land Grant Commission. The hearing was set for Monday morning. James spent the weekend rehearsing what he would say, organizing his evidence. On Sunday night, he could barely sleep. This wasn't just about his ranch anymore. This was about right and wrong, about powerful people thinking rules didn't apply to them. Monday morning dawned clear and hot. A typical Texas summer day. James put on his best suit, not the one he wore for ranch business, but the one he saved for Austin meetings. He packed his briefcase with the most important documents and drove to the county courthouse. The meeting room was already half full when he arrived. He recognized several Saddlebrook residents in the audience. Veronica Bennett sat at the table in front with Richard Campbell and their attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit. They were chatting confidently, like people who expected things to go their way. None of them looked at James as he took his seat at the side of the room. They didn't know why they'd been called to this hearing. They thought this was just another step in their plan to push him out. At precisely 9 o'clock, County Judge Franklin called the meeting to order. "We're here today for a special hearing requested by the State Land Grant Commission," the judge announced. "Commissioner Harrington, you have the floor." James stood up and walked to the podium. He could feel Veronica's eyes on him, could almost hear her brain trying to make the connection. "Thank you, Judge Franklin," James began. "For those who don't know me, I'm James Harrington, Commissioner with the State Land Grant Commission, the body that oversees and finalizes all major land, grant and boundary decisions in Texas." He paused, looking directly at Veronica and Richard. The shock on their faces was impossible to miss. "I'm also the owner of Double H Ranch, which borders Saddlebrook Estates." A murmur ran through the room. Richard Campbell leaned over to whisper urgently to their attorney, whose confident smile had disappeared. "The commission has undertaken a review of the ongoing boundary dispute between my ranch and Saddlebrook Estates," James continued. "But in the course of that review, we found irregularities that call into question not just the claims against my property, but the legal standing of development permits across 300 acres of Saddlebrook Estates itself." For the next 30 minutes, James laid out his findings. He explained how the development had been built on land with improperly transferred titles, how the water rights that supplied the community's decorative lakes and sprinkler systems existed in a legal gray area, how, without proper registration of boundary adjustments with the state commission, Saddlebrook's claim to jurisdiction over his ranch was completely invalid. In light of these findings, James concluded, the commission is initiating a comprehensive review of all land grants and water rights in Clearwater County, with particular focus on developments established in the last 20 years where documentation irregularities appear prevalent. The room had gone completely silent. Judge Franklin looked pale. "This review will include examining the circumstances surrounding the approval process for these developments, including any conflicts of interest or procedural violations." James made sure to look directly at Richard Campbell as he said this. The former judge stared back, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. "The commission's findings will be made public, with potential consequences including boundary revisions, water rights adjustments, and possible referrals to the state attorney general's office for any evidence of misconduct." James gathered his papers and looked around the room one last time. "This hearing is just the beginning. The commission will be sending official notices to all affected property owners by the end of the week. Thank you for your time." As James walked back to his seat, he caught the eye of a man in the back row, one of the Saddlebrook residents he'd seen at HOA meetings. Instead of anger, the man gave James a small nod of approval. Judge Franklin cleared his throat. "That's quite serious, Commissioner Harrington. Does the Saddlebrook Estates representative wish to respond?" The attorney leaned over to Veronica, who was furiously writing notes. After a moment, he stood up. "Your Honor, this is clearly a conflict of interest. Commissioner Harrington is using his position to gain advantage in a personal dispute. We request time to review these accusations and prepare a proper response. The commission anticipated that concern, James replied. That's why everything I've presented today has been independently verified by 2 other commissioners. This isn't personal, it's just enforcing the law. As the meeting adjourned, the Saddlebrook attorney approached James. We need to talk, he said quietly. Privately. Today. James nodded. My ranch. 3 o'clock. He walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunshine, feeling lighter than he had in months. The fight wasn't over, far from it. But for the first time since the barn burned, he felt like he might actually win. 3 o'clock came and went. James sat at his kitchen table watching the driveway through the window. He'd made coffee, set out cups, even put some of his grandmother's old cookies on a plate. Being hospitable was a habit, even with enemies. At 3:20, a cloud of dust announced visitors coming up the ranch road. 2 vehicles, the expected black sedan carrying the Saddlebrook attorney, and behind it, Veronica's white SUV. James hadn't expected her to come herself. That was interesting. He stepped onto the porch as they parked. Neither looked happy to be there. The attorney, whose name badge read Thomas Wilson, got out first, briefcase in hand. Veronica emerged more slowly, taking in the ranch with obvious distaste. Richard Campbell was with her, his face like a thundercloud. Welcome to Double H Ranch, James said, not bothering to hide the irony in his voice. Coffee's inside if you want some. They followed him in silence. No one took coffee. No one sat down. This wasn't a social visit. Let's get to the point, Wilson said finally. Your presentation this morning was clearly meant to strong-arm the association. We're willing to withdraw all claims against your property and discuss reasonable compensation for the unfortunate barn incident. The barn incident, James repeated. You mean the arson? We had nothing to do with that. Veronica cut in quickly. James raised an eyebrow. Interesting that you feel the need to deny it when I didn't actually accuse you. Richard stepped forward. Listen, Harrington, you made your point. You've got some fancy title and you can make trouble. We get it. Name your price and let's be done with this. My price, James said slowly, walking to the window that overlooked what remained of his grandfather's barn. You know what was in that barn? A tractor my grandfather restored by hand, tools that built this place, journals going back 100 years written by my family, documenting everything that happened on this land. He turned back to face them. You can't put a price on that. Everything has a price, Wilson said. Just tell us what you want. James had thought about this moment for days. What did he want? Revenge? Justice? To see them suffer like he had? None of that would rebuild his barn or bring back what he'd lost. I want 4 things, he said finally. First, a public acknowledgement that Double H Ranch is exempt from HOA jurisdiction and always has been. Second, fair market value for my destroyed barn and everything in it. Third, the resignation of board members who approved the escalation tactics against my property. He paused, looking at Veronica and Richard. Their faces had gone still, calculating. And fourth, Wilson prompted. A conservation easement on the development's western edge, creating a permanent buffer between Saddlebrook and surrounding ranch land. 20 acres to be exact. Richard snorted. Those 20 acres are worth millions. In potential development, they're worth even more as protected land, James replied. Water flows downhill, including all the chemicals from your perfect lawns and golf course. That easement protects the watershed for every ranch downstream. Wilson scribbled notes. And if we agree to these terms, then the Land Commission's broader investigation focuses elsewhere. Your residents keep their water rights. Your property values stay stable. And if we don't agree? Veronica asked, speaking for the first time since her denial. James smiled, without humor. Then I do my job. Every irregularity in Saddlebrook's permits becomes public record. Every shortcut in the approval process gets reviewed. Every water right gets rechecked against historical claims. I'm guessing your million-dollar houses become a lot less valuable when their legal foundation is questioned. The room fell silent. James could almost hear them calculating costs, weighing options. We need to discuss this with the full board, Wilson said finally. Of course. James walked them to the door. You have 1 week. As they drove away, James felt no satisfaction, just tiredness. Fighting took more energy than building. His grandfather had taught him that. 6 days later, a courier delivered a thick envelope to the ranch. Inside was a signed agreement meeting every one of his terms, plus a personal note from the HOA's attorney. The security guard responsible for the barn fire has been identified and turned over to the sheriff. The board directed him to send a message, but not to commit arson. He acted on his own in that regard. Within 2 weeks, Veronica Bennett and Richard Campbell had resigned from the board. The local paper ran a small story about leadership changes at Saddlebrook Estates, with a brief mention of a settlement with neighboring property owner James Harrington. The check for the barn came the following month. James stared at it for a long time before depositing it. Money couldn't replace what was lost, but it could rebuild. That weekend, he hired local craftsmen to help plan a new barn, built exactly like the old one, with the same beams, the same structure, the same heart. On a cool morning in October, James stood with Miguel and a dozen local ranchers, watching as the frame of the new barn rose against the sky. Men who knew how to work with their hands, who understood what it meant to build something that would last generations. Your grandfather would be proud, said Tom Jenkins, an old friend of his grandfather's who'd driven 40 miles to help. Standing your ground, then making peace, that was his way too. I didn't feel much like peace at first, James admitted. Tom laughed. Nobody does when they're wronged. Making peace after you've won, that's the hard part. The conservation easement became official that same month. 20 acres along the western edge of Saddlebrook Estates, protected forever from development. James worked with a local conservation group to restore native plants along the creek that ran through it. School kids came to learn about watersheds and ecosystems, planting wildflower seeds and building birdhouses. The new HOA board, led by that same resident who had nodded to James in the courthouse, took a different approach with neighboring properties. They invited local ranchers to speak at community meetings about the area's agricultural heritage. They reorganized their annual festival to celebrate both new and old community traditions. James found himself attending those meetings sometimes, offering advice on water conservation or answering questions about ranching practices. Boundaries still mattered. The HOA had no say over his land, and he had no vote in their affairs, but neighbors could still be neighbors. As for Commissioner Harrington, he divided his time between his Austin office and the ranch, finding balance between his two worlds. The Land Commission's broader review of county records led to improved procedures and greater transparency, though no major penalties for past corners cut. Some battles weren't worth fighting once the war was won. One evening, almost a year after the fire, James sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the new barn with golden light. His grandfather's old rocking chair creaked beneath him. In his lap lay a fresh leather-bound journal, the first page already filled with his handwriting, picking up the family story where the last journal had been lost. Some things could be rebuilt. Some things once burned away were gone forever. But the land remained, and on that land new stories would unfold, new memories would take root. His grandfather had understood that. Now James did too. The ranch would outlast them all. That was worth fighting for. That was worth making peace for too.